Deep in the fog-choked Hürtgen Forest, an American sniper pressed his cheek against cold mud, his partner's body lying motionless 3 feet away. Somewhere in the grey wall of trees ahead, an invisible enemy waited, a German marksman who had already killed 6 American scouts that week without ever being seen. The forest swallowed every sound, turned every shadow into a trap, and made every conventional tactic useless. Private First Class Samuel Hart knew the rules of engagement, knew the doctrine drilled into every sniper since basic training: aim true, fire straight, never deviate from your zero. But in that suffocating moment, with death hiding behind every trunk and the weight of another lost friend crushing his chest, Hart made a decision that would defy every rule he'd ever learned. He adjusted his scope deliberately off-center, aimed at a point he couldn't see, and fired at a tree instead of a target. The bullet screamed through the air, kissed the bark at a shallow angle, and bent around the obstacle like a guided hand reaching into the impossible. Somewhere in the fog, a body fell. The forest had just been beaten at its own game. Hürtgen Forest, November 1944. November rain settled over the Hürtgen Forest in a way that felt almost deliberate. Water slid down every branch and pulled in the mud around every foxhole. The forest swallowed sound, absorbed movement, and turned visibility into a claustrophobic blur. The men of the 28th Infantry Division had been fighting here for weeks, and many of them believed this stretch of woodland was more dangerous than any city or battlefield they had seen. In the valleys, the fog clung to the ground so tightly that even the brightest muzzle flash looked like a faint spark rather than a burst of fire. Private First Class Samuel Hart moved slowly through this terrain with his sniper partner, a young corporal from Ohio who had only been with him for a few months. They advanced through a narrow corridor of pine trees just before dawn, searching for the German sniper who had been killing American scouts along the ridge. German snipers in the Hürtgen Forest had perfected a method that Americans struggled to counter. They set up in triple-layered shadow pockets created by deep trunks and overlapping branches. These positions hid their bodies completely and allowed them to fire at angles that American optics could not penetrate. Hart knew this. He had lost 2 friends in the previous week to those same hidden rifles. The Springfield rifle he carried was accurate and dependable. The 8-power civilian-modified scope mounted on it offered clarity at long range. The problem was the forest itself. Branches broke the field of view. Light bent awkwardly, shadows blurred, and the more he scanned for movement, the more the forest mocked him with shifting shapes and false silhouettes. They were only 20 yards into their crawl when it happened. A faint crack echoed between the trees. Hart froze. His partner did not. The corporal collapsed forward, and the wet earth muffled his fall. Hart waited for the follow-up shot, which never came. The silence returned with a force that made the hairs on his neck stand upright. Somewhere in the fog, a German sniper had seen them before they had seen him. Hart pressed his cheek to the ground and slowly dragged himself behind a thick fallen log while every instinct screamed at him to run. The forest remained completely still. Hart breathed slowly, forcing his thoughts to steady. This was the same pattern he had seen again and again. American team spotted too late, an unseen enemy, a shot from an angle that made no sense. German snipers in the Hürtgen were not simply skilled marksmen. They were mathematicians of terrain. They knew exactly how trunks and branches fractured American sight lines. They understood how to exploit a limited field of view. Hart's Springfield scope allowed only a narrow sight picture, 8 degrees at most. In open fields, that was acceptable. In this forest, it was a death sentence. Hart inched upward until one eye aligned with a gap between 2 roots. He could see only a thin wedge of forest. Nothing moved. Nothing revealed the shooter. He knew the German would stay silent until the next patrol passed. That was the tactic. Wait, fire once, leave no trace, let the forest do the killing. Hart pressed his forehead against the stock of his rifle. He needed an advantage, something that could break the pattern of defeat. He studied the tree in front of him. The trunk was angled slightly to the left and splintered at the midsection. The bark was moist and coarse. He knew ricochet patterns. Every sniper did. A bullet striking bark at a shallow angle could deflect in a predictable arc. In training, this was considered a hazard, but in this forest, it might become a weapon. Hart recalled a conversation he once overheard from an older Marine sniper on Bougainville who had spoken about island fighting. The man claimed that bullets could be bent around obstacles if one understood how wood grain reacted to incoming fire. No one believed him. Hart remembered the story because the details were strange enough to stick with him. He had dismissed it as exaggerated barracks talk. Yet now, Crouched behind a fallen pine in the Hürtgen Forest, he reconsidered the idea. He wiped moisture from the objective lens of his scope. He adjusted his windage knob several clicks to the left. This was not a normal correction. It was a deliberate misalignment. By doing so, he aimed for a point he could not see. The idea defied established doctrine. The Army viewed deviation from standard zeroing as reckless. Hart understood the risk. A shot taken this way could travel unpredictably. It could hit nothing. It could strike the wrong target. But the German sniper already controlled the battlefield. If Hart followed the usual rules, he would lose like everyone else. He breathed slowly and scanned the fog tree line. No movement, no sound. But somewhere beyond his vision, an enemy was waiting. He found a knot in the bark on the right side of the tree. That knot represented a shallow angle, the kind a bullet could skim off and redirect. Hart took a long breath and pressed the trigger. The report echoed into the forest, and the ricochet cracked like a snapping branch. He lowered the rifle and listened. 10 seconds of silence passed. Then a faint rustle sounded deeper in the trees. A body shifting. Someone hit. Hart did not celebrate. He adjusted his zero back to normal and remained still. After a full minute, he moved to his fallen partner and checked for signs of life. There were none. He felt anger press against his ribs but forced himself to breathe slowly. The mission mattered. His partner's life could not be repaid, but the shot he had just taken meant something. It proved a possibility. Hart dragged the corporal's body to cover. He marked the location mentally and continued his crawl toward the ridge where the German sniper had been positioned. The fog grew thicker, but Hart felt a shift in his thinking. A new tactic had been born out of desperation. The ricochet shot, the off-angle zero, a method that allowed a marksman to hit a target he could not directly see. It violated every rule he had ever been taught. Yet it worked. And in the Hürtgen Forest, one working idea meant survival. Hart did not know it yet, but this improvised technique would spread through the division within days. It would become the whispered secret of sniper teams who were tired of losing partners to unseen shooters. And it would mark the beginning of a story that would ripple far beyond that cold November morning. The hours after Samuel Hart's first deflection shot were slow and heavy. The fog seemed to thicken as if the forest itself wished to hide every movement within its grasp. Hart moved through the trees with deliberate care, following faint impressions in the soil and the unnatural silence that often lingered in places where snipers had been positioned. Eventually, he found the German shooter slumped behind a tree, a thin line of blood running down his coat. The angle told the story. The bullet had not come from a direct path. It had skimmed the bark, curved slightly, and struck the man from a direction he had not anticipated. Hart studied the scene for almost a minute. The shot had not been luck. It had been the result of understanding how wood, moisture, and grain direction influenced deflection. And in the Hürtgen Forest, that knowledge could overturn the one advantage German marksmen had maintained for weeks. Hart returned to the American lines by late afternoon. The fog had thinned, and patches of light filtered through the branches. His company sergeant listened quietly as Hart recounted the encounter. The sergeant accepted the loss of the corporal with a brief moment of silence. When Hart described the shot he had taken, the sergeant raised an eyebrow but did not interrupt. Soldiers in the Hürtgen had witnessed stranger things. Out here, doctrine bent as easily as tree branches. 2 hours later, Hart was in a small clearing with 3 other sniper teams from the company. They had fought beside him in previous battles and trusted his judgment. Hart demonstrated the method slowly. He used a fallen stump to illustrate how angles created predictable deflection patterns. He explained the necessity of deliberately misaligning the rifle zero so that the point of impact was not the point of aim. At first, the men looked puzzled. One sniper asked why they should aim incorrectly on purpose. Hart replied that direct sight lines were worthless if the forest removed the ability to see. If the Germans could hide behind trunks and shadow pockets, then American snipers needed a way to bend their shots around those obstacles. The men practiced by firing at marked spots on logs. Each shot created unique patterns depending on bark thickness, moisture, and grain direction. Hart taught them to look at the impact marks and adjust the rifle zero accordingly. A slight twist to windage, a controlled adjustment to elevation, nothing extreme, everything measured. With enough repetition, the method became intuitive. The trick was not magic. It was geometry applied to chaotic terrain. By the next morning, the forest echoed with faint rifle cracks as sniper after sniper tested the technique. Some shots ricocheted too wide, others bent too shallow. But slowly, A pattern emerged. When the rifle was zeroed left and fired into moist bark at a shallow angle, the bullet typically curved inward. When fired into harder grain, it curved outward. When fired into splintered wood, it maintained a more linear path. Each deflection responded to specific conditions, and the snipers began learning those conditions through repetition, almost like musicians learning the weight of notes in a musical scale. Later that day, the technique was tested under fire. An American patrol took machine gun fire from a concealed German nest behind a thick patch of trees. Standard rifle fire could not reach the nest because visibility was blocked. Hart positioned himself behind a tree and deliberately misaligned his zero. He selected a trunk that would bend the shot toward the unseen position. The first shot missed by inches, but the second struck the bark at a more ideal angle. Moments later, the machine gun went silent. When the patrol advanced, they found 2 German soldiers downed by rounds that had not traveled in straight lines. Word spread quickly. Snipers from adjacent companies found Hart in the clearing and asked him to demonstrate the technique. He walked them through the method exactly as he had before. Fire, inspect the bark, adjust zero, repeat until the deflection matched the intended arc. Within 2 days, the 28th Division had a small group of marksmen who could bend bullets around obstacles with surprising accuracy. Command did not approve. When company officers read reports of deflection kills, they dismissed them as exaggeration or errors in observation. Official doctrine emphasized stability, alignment, and precision. The idea that a sniper would intentionally misalign a rifle went against everything the Army considered proper marksmanship. Yet the officers could not deny the results. German snipers who had maintained an unbroken kill streak for weeks were suddenly being outmaneuvered. Positions that had been considered invulnerable were now dangerous. The Germans noticed the shift as well. In several after-action reports collected by intelligence officers, German units referenced strange incoming fire that seemed to come from impossible angles. One report described it as shots that arrived from somewhere the Americans could not physically occupy. Another referenced bullets that clipped bark before striking soldiers hidden behind fallen pines. These reports revealed confusion and unease. German marksmen had relied on the forest to mask their positions. Now the forest had become unpredictable. Hart continued refining the technique. He discovered that deflection strength changed with weather conditions. Rain softened bark and increased the bend. Dry bark produced tighter curves. Frozen bark shattered and produced unpredictable fragments that could still reach hidden targets. He taught his section to feel the texture of a tree before firing. Smooth bark produced subtle curves. Rough bark generated more dramatic arcs. Every tree became a potential firing platform. Every shadowed gap a potential line of attack. Through all of this, Hart remained quiet about his role. He did not view the discovery as a personal achievement. He saw it as a necessity born from desperation and imminent loss. His partner from Ohio remained on his mind. The technique had been born from that moment when the German sniper had struck first. Hart knew that without adaptation, the same pattern would continue, and he refused to let that happen again. 3 days after Hart's initial shot, a team from another battalion requested instruction. They had suffered several losses and needed a countermeasure. Hart gathered them near the same training stump he had used with his own company. He explained every step with the same calm voice he had used from the beginning. The men listened carefully. They understood that this method could mean the difference between life and death. By the end of the week, 9 sniper teams within the division had adopted the off-angle zero trick. They used it to target mortar spotters hidden behind ridge lines. They used it to eliminate machine gun crews tucked behind tree formations that once provided complete protection. And they used it to counter the German flanking technique that had crippled American sniper operations for months. The forest, for the first time in weeks, felt less like an enemy and more like an ally. But the Hürtgen was not finished with them. The forest had a way of testing every new idea, and within days, the greatest test of the off-angle zero trick was about to arrive. The Hürtgen Forest tightened around the 28th Infantry Division in late November, as if the trees themselves intended to keep the fighting trapped within their grasp. The temperature dropped, the rain turned to sleet, and the fog thickened into a permanent sheet of grey. For days there were no major German movements, only probing shots and distant artillery. This silence felt unnatural. Hart sensed something coming. He watched the forest the way a hunter watches for the subtle signs that an animal is moving through the brush long before footsteps are heard. That calm broke on the morning of November 23rd. Scouts reported German infantry massing beyond the ridge, and moments later machine guns opened fire from multiple directions. Mortar rounds followed, Falling in a slow pattern meant to test American readiness. The German attack built in small increments. First a few bursts of fire, then sustained volleys. Then the distant clatter of vehicles moving through mud. Hart recognized the tactic. The Germans were feeling for weakness. They were searching for the seams in the American line. As the fire intensified, Hart moved with 2 other sniper teams to a forward position overlooking the draw. The squad leader briefed them quickly. German troops were advancing behind heavy screens of foliage. Machine gun crews were using fallen logs and root systems as natural bunkers. Mortar teams were concealed behind ridge lines and had already taken out 2 American rifle squads. Standard rifle fire could not reach them. Artillery support was spotty because communication lines were unstable. The fog swallowed every sound before it reached the treetops. Hart knelt behind a thick oak root and wiped the sleet from his scope. He waited. The forest offered no clear targets, only shifting movement in distant shadows. German soldiers moved with the confidence of men who believed the terrain favored them. Hart breathed slowly. The off-angle zero trick could work here. The forest created too many blind angles for conventional marksmanship. If the Germans were using camouflage and natural cover, the deflection method might be the only way to reach them. He adjusted his zero left, counting the clicks carefully. Moisture in the air made the bark softer. That meant a more pronounced curve. He selected a tree with a rough exterior and a split branch 2 feet above ground level. He studied the line between the trunk and the ridge beyond it. Somewhere behind that ridge, a German machine gun was firing across the American line with mechanical precision. He did not know the exact position. He did not need to. He needed only the angle. Hart fired. The sound cracked through the forest, and he listened for the secondary impact. A faint thud answered from beyond the ridge. The machine gun paused. Hart adjusted slightly and fired again. This time the gun fell silent. When the fog shifted a few minutes later, American scouts found a German machine gun team sprawled near a tree trunk with 2 bark-scored bullet paths nearby. The shots had bent exactly as Hart intended. Other sniper teams took up positions and repeated the technique. One team bent a shot around a large fallen pine, striking a spotter who had been directing mortar fire. Another team used a cluster of trees to eliminate a German marksman who believed his position was invisible. As more rifles fired, the Germans began to hesitate. Their advances lost coordination. Hart could sense their confusion. The forest no longer protected them the way it always had. The German counterattack intensified as the day went on. Infantry squads pushed forward under heavy fog, yelling commands that echoed strangely in the trees. American riflemen responded with steady fire. Mortars exploded in bursts of white pressure. The air grew thick with smoke. Through the chaos, Hart saw a tall officer directing the German assault from behind a slanted pine trunk. His position was perfect. He was shielded from direct fire. Hart knew a standard shot could not reach him. The trunk absorbed every bullet that struck it. Hart felt the weight of the moment. The officer was coordinating the German push. If he remained alive, the attack would continue with deadly precision. Hart selected a tree to his right. The bark was wet and heavily ridged. The angle was narrow but feasible. He adjusted his zero further than before, intentionally misaligning the rifle in a way that would horrify any marksmanship instructor. He steadied his breath and fired. The bullet struck the bark and deflected with a metallic crack. Hart listened. He saw the officer jerk sideways and fall. His men stopped mid-advance. Confusion rippled through their formation. Without clear orders, the German push faltered. American riflemen seized the initiative and poured fire into the scattered clusters of infantry. What had been a coordinated assault collapsed into a hesitant retreat. The newspapers would never record that moment. No official report would mention the off-angle zero shot that broke the attack. But the men who were there remembered. They spoke quietly in their foxholes that night about the way bullets bent around obstacles. They spoke about Hart's method. They spoke about how one improvised technique helped pull an entire battalion away from the edge of collapse. As the fighting died down, the battalion commander visited the sniper section. He listened as Hart explained the technique one final time. He did not officially endorse it. He worried about the risks, but he did not forbid it either. In war, results often spoke louder than doctrine, and every man in that forest wanted an edge, even one that lived outside the neat boundaries of formal training. When the division withdrew from the Hürtgen weeks later, the trick traveled with them. Snipers shared it in informal sessions behind ruined barns or inside half-collapsed houses. Some improved it, others doubted it, but all acknowledged the strange truth that had emerged from the forest. Sometimes the environment dictated the method. Sometimes survival required bending rules as well as bullets. After the war, a small group of instructors at Fort Benning reviewed unusual sniper reports from the European theater. They noticed references to curved shot patterns and deflection engagements. These mentions were rare and unendorsed, yet they piqued the curiosity of a few instructors. Quietly, they incorporated controlled deflection theory into experimental training modules. No official manual ever named it. No doctrine ever celebrated it. But the spirit of the idea survived, tucked inside the intuitive knowledge passed from marksman to marksman. Samuel Hart never considered himself an inventor. He viewed his discovery as a necessity driven by the brutal landscape of the Hürtgen Forest. He did not write books or seek recognition. After returning home, he rarely spoke of the war. But among the men who fought beside him, and among the snipers who survived the forest, his name lingered. They remembered the cold November morning when desperation became innovation. They remembered the moment when a single idea reshaped their chances of living through the battle. And they remembered that in the darkest forest of the European war, a man could change the outcome of a fight, not with better weapons or clearer sightlines, but with the courage to aim at something he could not see.